guys, so I'm here today with a book haul. I have a bunch of books, many of which were sent to me by publishers, a few I picked up myself, one from the library, so without further ado, let's jump straight in. I'm going to start off with a book that I was sent by Bloomsbury Publishing and I am so incredibly excited about. That is Athena, the Story of a Goddess by Isabel Greenberg and Imogen Greenberg. So Isabel Greenberg is probably my favourite graphic novelist. She has previously brought out 100 Nights of Hero and the Encyclopedia of Early Earth, both of which I adore. And this is her latest sort of full book graphic novel type contribution to the world of literature. But this one was done in collaboration with her sister, and it is, as the title suggests, all about the Greek goddess Athena. And you know, I love me some modern takes on ancient myths and gods and kind of contemporary literature that explores that topic and introduces people to that topic, so I was so keen to check this out. I already know I love Isabel Greenberg's artwork, so like here's an example of some of it. And obviously I'm very familiar already with the goddess Athena. I will be interested to see how she and her sister bring her to life in this volume, but super duper excited about this. I did mention I had a book from the library, however, and this book I actually mentioned in my Booktubeathon TBR as a book I would potentially read during the Booktubeathon. I didn't, but I did borrow it from the library and it will hopefully be getting read soon. And that is The Clan of the Cave Bear. This is the first in a series called the Earth's Children series, and apparently there's tons of these. I didn't quite realise, but I think it's quite a long series, which is all the better if I enjoy the first one. And what is so striking about this historical fiction series is that it's actually set in sort of prehistoric times, which is how you describe the time before people started writing things down, and it doesn't even follow Homo sapiens. It follows a Homo Neanderthal and another type of hominid that's not detailed in the back, but it's our main character who's called Ayla, and she is orphaned due to a natural disaster that kills her family, and she's taken in by a clan of Neanderthals and raised alongside them. And I believe this first book kind of details her younger years growing up with these people, and as they go on there's perhaps a romance between this character and a Neanderthal. But I actually really enjoy prehistoric archaeology. It's something that I was very interested in at university, even though I didn't pursue it in any way as a career. So I love the idea of following a historical fiction novel that centres on characters who aren't Homo sapiens. I think that's such a fascinating concept. But the next two books were sent to me by Europa, who are a publishing house that publish translated fiction, and the first one I'm actually already reading, and that is A Winter's Promise by Christelle Dabos. This is the first book in the Mirror Visitor series, and I believe the only one that's been translated so far, as it's just been released in English, and I can safely say I am thoroughly enjoying this book, so I so hope that the translations of the next few in the series come out in the near future, because I think I'm going to finish this one quite soon. I'm on page 127 and it's just over 400 pages, and I've read that in 2 days. It's such a quick, immersive reading experience. If you're curious, this is a fantasy novel set in a universe of the author's own imagination, and our protagonist is a young girl who can both read the memories of objects, so when she touches objects she sees their past and the past of their previous owners, and she can also travel through mirrors, and everyone from where she's from has different abilities, small little magical things like that, but she's particularly skilled at what she does. However, she has been betrothed to a man from another land as part of a sort of political alliance, and she is sort of being forced to marry him even though she doesn't want to, but she doesn't have any choice because otherwise she'll be ostracised from her home and her family. So I will say no more, but I'm really enjoying this book, and that cover, look at that cover, it's stunning. I'm in love with this. But they also very kindly sent me the proof copy of a crime novel that I was interested in, which is The Second Rider by Alex Beer, and this one's translated from the German. This one is set in Austria just after World War I, and a dark crime has taken place in the city of Vienna, and our inspector has to figure out what's going on. The last few sentences on the blurb read, "Enter Inspector August Emmerich, a veteran himself whose ambition leads him to bend the rules when necessary. Emmerich becomes becomes convinced that a corpse found in the woods outside the city is anything but a suicide. His investigations reveal an insidious and homicidal urge lurking in the city. The next book I have to hand was also sent to me by the publishers, and it is Franklin and Luna Go to the Moon by Jen Campbell, illustrated by Katie Hartnett. This was sent to me by Thames and Hudson, and it is the second book in Jen Campbell's children's picture book series. The first of which is Franklin's Flying Bookshop, which I have and adore. Obviously Jen is a friend of mine, I'm sure you're all familiar at this point, but I truly think her prose are stunning, and this is a gorgeous example of sort of a narrative poem for children with gorgeous illustrations. Katie really brings this story to life visually, so I think really well paired, I have to say. That's some of what it looks like inside. You also know I love dragons, so it's always down for this, and I'm so pleased to have a copy of this. It's so beautiful. I then have a cookbook, because why not? This was sent to me by Pan Macmillan and their imprint Bluebird that publishes a lot of non-fiction lifestyle type books, and it is Cooking on a Bootstrap by Jack Monroe. Jack Monroe is pretty great. I follow her on Twitter and I really like her online on social media. She just seems awesome. She just talks about really important stuff and actually doesn't just talk about recipes, but talks about food shortages and poverty and all these kind of things. And obviously this book, Cooking on a Bootstrap, is all about cooking meals on a budget, and you know, I mean, I ain't rolling in money, so I'm so down for that. Yeah, and it's just a recipe book. We've got loads of different things in there with pictures. It's not exclusively vegetarian, but there are vegetarian recipes in there, so I'm excited to try this. And there's some desserts, and I'm always down for doing some baking, so excited. The next two books were all sent to me by Vintage. The first two are from the imprint Jonathan Cape, and the first one is actually on the Man Booker long list for 2018, and that is Everything Under by Daisy Johnson. Another phenomenally beautiful cover, can't get over this one. And this is, like I said, longlisted for this year's Man Booker Prize, and the reason that I was really interested to read it is it's actually loosely inspired by the Greek myth of Oedipus, and if you tell me something is in any way inspired by Greek myth, I'm gonna want to read it. The blurb reads, "Words have always mattered to Gretel. As a child she lived on a canal boat with her mother, and together they invented a language that was just their own. She hasn't seen her mother since the age of 16, though almost a lifetime ago, and those memories have faded. Now Gretel works as a lexicographer, updating dictionary entries which suit her solitary nature. A phone call from a hospital interrupts Gretel's isolation and throws up questions from long ago. She begins to remember the private vocabulary of her childhood. She remembers other things too. The wild years spent on the river, the strange, lonely boy who came to stay on the boat one winter, and the creature in the water, a canal thief, swimming upstream, getting ever closer. In the end, there will be nothing for Gretel to do but go back." So I'm really intrigued to see how this book is based on Oedipus, because it's in no way clear from the blurb, and the blurb also sounds really intriguing. It's a literary fiction novel that I'm sure is going to be full of stunning writing, and it's also not particularly long, just about 250 pages, so one I'll get to soon. And on the topic of myth retellings, so is my next book from Vintage, and that is Metamorphosis by Zachary Mason. Zachary Mason previously wrote the Lost Books of the Odyssey, which I don't know if you've heard of, but I actually have a copy that my dad gifted me, and that is obviously based on Homer's Odyssey. This book, however, is based on Ovid's Metamorphosis, and that is where the title comes from, the Metamorphosis. So Ovid's Metamorphosis is a piece of Latin literature that collects together myths where people transform into other things, so like Daphne turning into the tree. And that is what Metamorphosis is, and that is what this book is doing. It's retelling those stories. So I'm super duper excited for this one, and another stunning cover. I'm really digging the covers in this haul actually, and gold foiling, yes. And the third book I was sent from Vintage is Pants Drunk, The Finnish Art of Drinking at Home Alone in Your Underwear by Miska Rantanen. I hadn't heard of this book. It was a surprise when it came in the post, but I had to keep it, and I'm gonna have to have a flick through it because it just sounds hilarious. It says Pants Drunk is a refreshing take on the personal development genre. Fresh out of Finland, it encourages drinking at home alone in your underwear. The next book I bought myself, but I have to say I made a little bit of a mistake with this one. Not that it doesn't sound intriguing, but it is Valley of the Soul by Tamara Siller Jones. Now I actually picked this up along with another book I picked up in my last haul and forgot to mention it. It was from Transreal, which is a bookshop in Edinburgh that specialises in fantasy and science fiction, and I like to go in there because you can discover books that you might not have discovered anywhere else. They've got a really eclectic selection, and this is a fantasy crime novel. Doesn't that sound phenomenal? This sentence says, award-winning author Tamara Siller-Jones delivers a knockout thriller that combines fantasy and forensics as an investigator unravels a mystery of murder, bloodlines and black magic. I love fantasy, I love crime novels. Honestly, this just sounds like my dream. However, this is not the first in a series, which is not unfortunately made clear. I just think it should be mandatory if you're writing books of a series that the numbers go on the side or something, so that it's obvious to anyone picking it up that it is not the first in a series. Now, I don't always think books need to be read in order, especially if they're books, say, like Sherlock Holmes, that are crime books where each book is very much a separate mystery. However, this may very well have overarching plot elements that I need to know about to follow, so I am going to look into picking up the first and maybe second book. I think this isn't even the second book, I think it's the third book. So I'd love to know if you've read any of the books in this series and whether it's worth me prioritising finding the first one, because it does sound like such a cool concept. I just can't believe I picked up a book that's not the first in a series, but oh well. On the topic of fantasy though, I have some very exciting books, which are these from Gallant. So I was sent these books by Gallant, and the first four are all from the Fantasy Masterwork series. So you might be slightly more familiar with their science fiction masterwork series, which are yellow, but they do also have a fantasy masterwork series, which are sort of republications of classic fantasy novels that have had big impact on the genre and are considered pretty good examples of the genre. And they very kindly sent me four after I said I would like to check some out and would happily just receive a random selection. The first one I have actually read though, and that is The Forgotten Beasts of Eld by Patricia A. McKillip. I borrowed this book at the library and read it recently, so I'll link the video where I review it. But I'm very pleased to have my own copy of it because I really enjoyed it. I really like Patricia A. McKillip. She is a beautiful writer with a wild imagination that is just fantasy at its truest for me as a reader. It feels like real true high fantasy that meets all of your expectations from that genre, which makes me unsurprised that it made its way into the Fantasy Masterwork series. This one follows a young wizardess who lives alone, isolated on a mountain in her palace with magical creatures, when one day she is given the son of the king, who is a baby, to take care of, for he is in mortal peril. I then have one that sounds really interesting, and that is Beauty by Sherry S. Tepper. This one actually sounds like a bit of a crossover between fantasy and science fiction because it does involve time travel. It also sounds very much as if it's been inspired by the fairy tale of Sleeping Beauty and perhaps some other fairy tales as well, so loads of awesome stuff happening there. It follows a young girl called Beauty who has managed to escape the curse of being pricked by the needle and being sent into an enchanted slumber, but she's escaped this by time travelling to the future, to a world where she feels completely out of place, and I am so interested in that. I have never heard of this book or anything quite like it, so I'm really excited. I then have Thomas the Rhymer by Ellen Kushner. Now this sounds very much like the classic folk tales of Scotland and Celtic folklore that I'm used to growing up. And it's about Thomas the Rhymer, who is a gifted musician, and this makes him capture the eye of the fairy queen. And what happens when the fairies like somebody and their skills, particularly musicians, they steal them away to the fairy realm and trap them there. And it's about his experience in the fairy realm and also what happens when he returns to the mortal realm. It sounds like a good classic bit of folklore, and I'm just, again, just really excited for this. I have to say the last one's blurb slightly baffles me, but that actually makes me want to read it more, and that is Little Big by John Crowley. And I'll just read you the back because I can't summarise this, but it says, Edgewood is many houses, all put inside each other or across each other. It's filled with and surrounded by mystery and enchantment. The further in you go, the bigger it gets. Smoky Barnable, who has fallen in love with Daily Alice Drinkwater, comes to Edgewood, her family home, where he finds himself drawn into a world of magical strangeness. Honestly, don't know what to expect from this, but sounds really intriguing and I trust it because it's part of this series. But lastly, I was sent a book I wasn't expecting by Glance, but sounds really interesting, and that is Lud in the Mist by Hope Merlis. And this is another stunning cover. What can I say? It's been the Hall of Beautiful Covers, and it's about a community that have close ties with the fairy world, except that one of their residents, Lud, refuses to believe in or be involved in anything that he isn't solidly familiar with and that isn't from his world, but I imagine that the fairy magical world seeps into his life whether he likes it or not. But lastly, I actually wanted to mention some audiobooks that I downloaded. I had built up a few credits on Audible because I hadn't used them immediately, so I decided to pick up a few books on Audible that I was interested in. The first one is Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn Ward. I picked this one up on the recommendation of Kendra, who has a booktube channel which is wonderful. I highly recommend going and checking it out. And this book is set in the build up to Hurricane Katrina, and it's about a young girl who is 14 or 15 and she is pregnant, and there's so much going on, but at the same time it's also quite a simple storyline, so I'm not quite sure how to describe it. But what really sold me to read it was the fact that it draws on classical myths. It's not a myth retelling by any means, but our protagonist is really interested in Greek mythology, and in particular the myth of Jason and Medea, and she often relates her own experiences to that of Medea, which I thought was such a wonderful concept. I loved the bringing together of these different ideas, and it was beautifully done. As you can probably gather, I've already listened to this one and really enjoyed it. I actually reviewed it in my Booktubeathon reading wrap up, so I'll link that if you're interested. I also downloaded Why Be Happy When You Can Be Normal by Jeanette Winterson. So this is Jeanette Winterson's autobiography, and I'm currently listening to this one at the moment. I recently read Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson, which is a semi-autobiographical fiction novel that she wrote, and it was one of my favourite books I've read all year, that I really wanted to read Jeanette Winterson's actual autobiography that came out a few years later. And I'm really enjoying this one too, and it is interesting because it's very aware of Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, and she often comments on that novel and what is fact and what isn't fact from it, and expands upon that. And I believe we also hear her story about how she sought out and met her birth mother eventually, which isn't something that happens in Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. So I'm just very much enjoying it. I love Jeanette Winterson's prose, and they're equally as beautiful to listen to as they are to read, and she narrates the audiobook, which I always think is the best way with an autobiography. But lastly, for audiobooks, I also downloaded Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind by Yuval Noah Harari. So this is a non-fiction book again, and it's one a lot of people were asking me recently if I'd read. I think because I mentioned this book and my interest in prehistoric archaeology and the evolution of humans. And this is, as the title suggests, it is a history of humankind all the way from our, first evolutionary steps into the planet and how we changed and adapted over time, and I imagine it comes quite close to modern day. I haven't read this one yet, so I'm not sure, but I think it's just quite an accessible all-round history of humanity, and I think that'll be really, really interesting. I've also just heard generally fantastic things about it, so although I'm sure I'm familiar with some of it in more depth, I think it will also create a fuller picture for me and fill me in on stuff I didn't know about. But those are all of the books that I have recently picked up, been sent, borrowed or downloaded, so I hope you have enjoyed this book haul. I would love to hear from you if you have read or are interested in reading any of these books. As always, I'm incredibly excited about everything that I have sort of stacked up on my TBR recently, or have even recently read, so I love chatting about them with you guys. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye!